Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. For many, we live in a world turned upside down. Traditional political divides are now blurry, and traditional political labels rendered meaningless. Today, it's liberalism that shows itself to be intolerant and decidedly pro-war. Cross-talking the liberal worldview, I'm joined by my guest, Sarah Flounders in New York. She is co-director of the International Action Center, as well as an author and an anti-war activist. In Berkeley, we have John Walsh. He is a scientist, peace activist, and author of numerous anti-war publications. And in Tehran, we cross to Mohammad Marandi. He's an associate professor at the University of Tehran. All right, cross-talk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always encourage it. Let me go to Sarah first in New York. There's a perception, and I essentially agree with it, that the left progressive now are actually more pro-war than the traditional right. I mean, I know that during different times in history, particularly in the United States, you'll have Democrats going to war. But I mean, this perception came out of the Vietnam War and its aftermath that the left was going to be more anti-war and the Republicans and people on the right are more pro-war. Now we have a flip-flop here. How do you account for that?
Well, let me first say there's two political parties in the U.S. that dominate, and they're both for war. They're both for the expansion of NATO. They're both for sanctions. And that is the real problem, that there's an independent movement from below that's left, that's progressive, that's anti-war. There's a poll out Wednesday, February 23rd, that says 2/3 of the population in the U.S. is firmly against more war and is fearful in the next 4 years of a major war coming down. So that is a terrain today where the movement from below is completely at odds with both political parties, neither of them left, neither of them progressive. And the Democrats really are trying to cover their total collapse, both presidency and Congress, in state capitals across the country, and blame it on hacking from Russia, rather than seeing their own policies, really their own bankrupt policies that created this problem. And there's a huge movement coming from below. So you have a movement above. That's one thing. They're trying to administer an empire. You have a movement from below that's totally at odds from that. And seeing this as a real difference, there's a different terrain in the U.S. today. And I think we need to pay attention to just how sharp that difference is.
Okay, John,
both parties are out of touch with the population
I would agree,
of the U.S.
And both parties like war. And I'd like to point out here, the mainstream media loves war even more. Right. Okay, John in Berkeley, let me go to you. I mean, Sarah kind of jumped to the chase on there, and I was going to talk a little bit later about bipartisanship. But that's one of the problems as well, is that there's no longer a foreign policy debate. There hasn't been one for a very long time now, because both parties are in unison. We have the deep state here, and we have a mainstream media that never says no to any conflict that comes its way. I mean, this is a stacked deck against efforts for more diplomacy in the world. Go ahead, John.
Well, I know the conventional progressive view is that there is this movement from below, which is always struggling to break out. But I was just at a town hall meeting for Barbara Lee the other day in this district. This is Berkeley. Barbara Lee is probably maybe the best congressperson we have. It was attended by mostly, I would say, white liberals. There was a smattering of people of other races who are, many of them from the Vietnam era, many of them who were anti-war. And when the topic came up in the question and answer of impeaching Trump for his ties with Putin, the crowd went wild cheering. And the people I talked to there, they were very much in favor of confronting Putin as vigorously as possible. And when I said, well, this could lead to war, it didn't seem to faze them the least little bit. And I think we have to say that, that yes, in a sense, both parties are parties of war, but it's clear that in the last election, there was one candidate that was more bellicose than the other, and one candidate that was talking about getting along with Russia, which to me means survival. And I don't think when you're close to Holocaust, nuclear Holocaust, and I think we are, and many other people think we are because tensions are very high, when you dismiss that out of hand, I think that's pretty crazy. And I don't think you can just say that the two parties are equal anymore.
Okay, let me go to Mohammed in Tehran. Mohammed, one of the reasons why I had you on, because, you know, we saw an election cycle in the United States. We saw a U.S. government and its foreign policy anti-Iran. We have a dramatic upset, a huge change, but the policies didn't change towards Iran. It didn't change towards Russia whatsoever. You know, the continuity is remarkable. You can have these amazing personalities and these really crazy, quirky elections, but at the end of the day, the deep state more or less has its control on things. A lot of it, the rest of it is just theatrics, you know? Go ahead, Mohammed.
Well, I think one of the major problems, as your two guests rightly pointed out in their own way, is that the two parties are not really all that different. The Democrats and the Republicans have very similar economic policies. They're neoliberal, and they have very similar foreign policies. And their differences, I think, have more to do with identity politics. Although I'm simplifying, and it's a lot more complicated than that. But I think this is to a degree a reasonable simplification. And the problem is that neoliberalism is, I think, it encourages, it's linked to individualism and a sort of selfishness. People are out to make a quick buck, and the commodification of everything in society, including human beings, and so on and so forth. And in the past, liberalism has really emptied out the rest of the world. And the West really, at least the middle class, didn't face the suffering of neoliberalism. But now it's reached the United States and much of Europe, and we see the collapse of the middle class, because the neoliberals are basically out to make money. They're not there to make jobs for Americans or for Europeans. They're to make greater profit. So now the United States is facing a major crisis. And Trump took advantage of this nationalism and the issue of tariffs and bringing back jobs to America are a major reason why Trump won the election. But alongside that, and I think this is very much with the help of people like Bannon, the white nationalism has been advocated as well. And thus you see Muslims demonize Iranians, you see Latinos and Mexicans and the whole population of Latin America basically demonized as well. So I think it's a combination of many of these things. But in the case of Iran, I think there is continuity. I think even in the case of Russia, it's continuity, as you rightly point out, because the deep state, the establishment, does not want change. And I think a lot of that is linked to emotions, the Cold War, old hatreds for Iran and Russia, but also I think it's the military-industrial complex, and of course just sheer opposition to Trump. So right now the United States is very confusing, and I still can't make sense of what's going on.
Well, my friend, I have to agree with you. I gave myself 100 days, the traditional 100 days, to draw some conclusions. We're not even close there. Let me go back to Sarah. You know, again, this continuity here. What is interesting is that we have this career foreign policy establishment in Washington and their think tanks around them, and they're the last people that want to see change. I mean, all of them are very comfortable with their world view. Who's the enemy? Who could potentially be an enemy? I mean, it serves their even material interests here, and they do fear a multipolar world, because that would really upturn the apple cart, and that's something they do not want. Old stereotypes and old enemies suit their purposes. Go ahead, Sarah.
Well, very much they're interested in administering an empire that is in crisis, that's in decline, that's seriously decaying. They can no longer offer economic improvement in the lives here at home or anywhere globally. It's strictly military threats, increased police force at home, increased military threats abroad. That's the only thing they have to offer the people of the world and the people right here. And that's making a big divide. Now you have Trump with his absolute racism, an extreme level of racism, of anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant attacks. And at the same time, there were people who thought, oh, well, maybe there'll be a lessening of war threats. And then we find, of course, he stands for an increase in the military budget and sanctions on Iran, and a level of threats that is hand in hand. He knows how to get support from corporate America, and that is military threats. So a completely reactionary program at home and threats on the world. What's the Democratic Party's response to this? It's actually to try to go to the right.
Right,
and
exactly.
Raise the level of threats against Russia. It's an amazing thing that you couldn't have predicted or expected, because the population as a whole is rejecting. When you see the thousands, tens of thousands, who turned out instantaneously, couple hours notice at the airports against the Muslim ban, to stand in solidarity with those under attack. When you see the number of people around the country calling for the sanctuary cities, that their city be a welcoming, protective center for immigrants, those are the movements from below that are really standing up against Trump's racism and anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant thrust. And that is a force that we need to rely on. The corporate media, of course, runs hand in hand with corporate war policy. That's where the big profits are. And they'll tell you that's all that there is in the world. But people themselves are finding each other and finding resistance on a level that I have not seen in decades. And there's not a day that goes by that there aren't major demonstrations happening. So that's what we have to look at.
We have to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the liberal worldview. Stay with our team. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. To remind you, we're discussing the liberal worldview. Okay, I'd like to go to John back in Berkeley here. I think we need to push back a little bit from what Sarah had to say here, because I think the electorate did vote against identity politics. I think that was part of the, foreign policy was there, but it was usually these issues that motivated a lot of people here. And it did win him the election, at least the Electoral College. So, I think that the identity politics is something that the left embraced. And instead of looking after the lower classes and the dispossessed and the weak, they embrace this, and I think this is what's pushed back against them in electoral politics, and not just in this election. Over the last few elections since 2008, including midterms and governorships, etc. Go ahead, John.
Well, I don't know where to begin. Identity politics is, yes, the Democrats and most of the progressives have embraced it over and above the traditional concern of the left. I think a thing that identifies the left is class politics. And actually, if you look at it in the election, despite all his weaknesses and the awful rhetoric, Trump was playing class politics to the Democrats' identity politics.
Yep.
And so in some sense, the progressives are fake leftists because they do not embrace class as the central organizing point of their politics. So that's one thing. Another thing I want to say, which I think is very important, I do agree that the United States is now an empire that is very afraid that it's going to lose its hold on the world and definitely lose its ability to move forward. Who are the obstacles to that? Russia, Iran, and China. So, and Russia's in the crosshairs. I think they figure if they can get Russia and get a regime change there, then China will have Japan at its front door, Russia with the regime change at its back door, and China will be done. And I don't think there's much doubt that they're also going to try to boycott, prevent oil from going into China in the next, if they can get away with it militarily. So that's the truth. It's military. It's a military attempt, a desperate attempt to get control of the world again and extend that control if possible. So that puts us in a very precarious position. That leaves us open to nuclear war. And when a candidate like Trump comes along, even though it's a long shot and at tremendous political cost, says he wants to get along with Russia, cooperate with Russia, when he says that and the progressives just dismiss it out of hand, I think that's a disservice to humanity. I think it may be a frail reed, but right now it's one reed we have to grasp.
I want to jump
and I
in.
think we should give Trump the chance to do that despite all his other weaknesses. The stale dogmatism that is going to define our course of action is not going to work at this particular near tragic moment in history. And I think we just one other thing. I think you can define and understand how dangerous the establishment feels that is, because, well, yeah, I know you don't. But all the neocons, all the hawks are trying their damnedest to get rid of Trump. And I'm sorry to see the progressives de facto in alliance with them. That doesn't make sense. I agree, too. Now.
I mean, they're very undemocratic in their thinking right now. Go ahead, Sarah, and jump in. That's the point of the program.
Well, let's not give Trump any chance. The idea that we should give Trump a chance to carry
the American
out
people
the
don't the American people deserve that? He was elected president of the United States.
The people of the world absolutely don't deserve that.
Well, no, that's not up to the world. It's up to
any chance for
democratic
peace is such an illusion. He is for the expansion of NATO. He's for the expansion of the military budget.
What you're doing is destroying American institutions. You're destroying American institutions because you hate someone. Because you hate someone.
Really look at what Trump is doing.
That is simply pathetic from the left.
Let's look at what Trump is doing,
from the left.
Not at your crazy illusions.
Okay, just because you didn't vote for him, other people did.
Let's look at what he's doing.
This is exactly what is wrong with the progressive left.
When you we're not having a discussion at all.
No, we're not. Not because you don't want to play by the rules. You don't want to play by the rules.
And they're both for war. And you know that too. You know it.
All right.
Both parties are for war.
What you're doing is throwing everything out.
Budget.
All right, Sarah. I want to have free time. I want to have equal time.
A lot of slur words about identity politics.
Sarah, I don't want to have to cut your mic. I have other guests.
We have
other guests.
The ruling establishment.
We have other guests. Okay, would you be democratic and be fair to the other guests on this program? Thank you. That's appreciated. Mohammed, if I can go to you in Tehran, I think one of the gambits that people have thrown out from the Trump people is that he has surrounded himself with these people that are very anti-Iran. And they think, and I think it's really naive and very dangerous, that they can appease Russia somehow to break its relationship with Iran, and so Iran will stand alone, okay? And that is just illusory. That is not going to happen. There was a moment in time 25 years ago that Yeltsin might have made a deal with the West, but today in 2017, there is no trust of the people in Washington, of the deep state, and they didn't care which party won the election. Go ahead, Mohammed.
Well, if I could first point something out, and that is that regardless of the issue between Trump and Clinton, because in my personal opinion, not as an Iranian, but personally, I think that neither of them are good for the United States or for the world, and that the whole process in the United States is completely undemocratic. It's not a democracy, it's a plutocracy. You have the corporate media divided into two parts, most of it supporting whoever is against Trump, and then you have Fox News supporting Trump, and we know the history of Fox News over the past couple of decades. And people are getting most of their information from the corporate media and from the major media outlets that are linked to the corporate media, because there are basically 6 corporations in the United States that control over 90% of all of the media in the country. So people and that's why, unfortunately, I'm a bit skeptical about the future.
Me too.
In the United States from within, because the mass media has been able to manipulate the public and public perceptions in the past. Even, for example, in England, when the overwhelming majority of people were against the Iraq War, this didn't last. And in the United States, people were against the war, and then Obama came, and we had a continuation of Bush. Perhaps in many ways, Obama was worse because he was a very good salesman, and whereas Bush was not. So he silenced opposition, but he carried out drone strikes, he destroyed Libya, he's destroying Yemen, he's creating mass starvation in Yemen with the Saudis, he's destroyed so much of Syria. It's horrific. These are crimes against humanity. But with regards to Iran, I agree that there doesn't seem to be any major difference between the Trump team and the people who would have surrounded Clinton, in that there's enormous hostility towards Iran. And I think it's for a number of reasons. Part of it is emotional. They never got over the fact that Iran had a revolution and moved away from the United States and gained its independence. Part of it is because they are so closely affiliated to the Israeli apartheid regime, as I would call it, and the Israelis have huge influence in the United States, and this is against the interests of the American people, in my opinion, pursuing pro-Israeli policies. And of course, there's the oil money that's coming from the Persian Gulf region that's corrupted so much of the think tanks and the establishment in the United States, just as the military-industrial complex has done the same as well. This corruption is a result of this wealth that's being pushed into D.C. But I think at the end of the day, the Iranians are not looking to see who in Washington is going to make things better. The Iranians have pursued an independent foreign policy for 38 years. Yeah. In the case of Syria, for the last 6 years, the Iranians made sure that the Syrian government wasn't overthrown by the extremists that the United States and its regional allies were supporting, the Wahhabi extremists. And the irony is that right now Trump is actually speaking with the Saudis. And these are the Saudis are the same people who are promoting the Wahhabi ideology. So as I said at the beginning of the program, there's such confusion in the United States. Just like the fact that Trump is talking about nationalist economics, yet he's surrounded himself with people from Goldman Sachs.
Exactly.
It's just utter confusion.
We're running out of time here. I want to ask John and Sarah. John first. Go ahead, and then what is the future of the anti-war movement? Go ahead, John, and then we'll go to Sarah. Go ahead.
I'd just like to comment on Iran, because I think Mohammed made a lot of good points. One point, I think, is that détente with Russia is not possible with hostility toward Iran. Those two things are in conflict. And that is the hostility to Iran, which is really promoted by Israel. It's the Israeli influence in the U.S. Government and the whole of U.S., its culture and everything else. It is that hostility to Iran, which has to be, we have to get rid of it.
Get over it.
It has to be tempered. It has to be tamped down, and I think that this is a choice point for Trump. If he really does desire détente with Russia, I think he does, he has to change his opinion on Iran. There's no question about that. And I think that the real, if I may say so, wacko nutcase around him on Iran was Mike Flynn. And Mike Flynn did not have to be dismissed, but he just was. Okay. And maybe, just maybe, John, that might be a bit of good news.
Hang on. I want to give Sarah the last word. What is the future of the anti-war movement? Go ahead, 20 seconds.
All right, I think the future of the anti-war movement is to absolutely realize that the two-party system is both for war, and the only way forward is an independent movement from below that welds together opposition to the war here at home and the wars abroad against all the countries of the world, and including in that the threats on Russia and China and Iran and of course Syria and Cuba and Venezuela, and talking about it also in solidarity with Standing Rock, with the Black Lives Matter movement right here.
We've run out of time here.
These are the movements we've got to pull together.
At least on this point, I agree with Sarah. Okay. Many thanks to my guests in Berkeley, New York, and in Tehran. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.
believe that this will not be scientific. I love you.